All right, good evening, everyone. If you'll take your seats, we'll get started. Thanks to all of you who are here and all of you who are in the ether watching us now. My name is Sean Kylan. I am a professor of literature and one of the founders and co-directors of the Deep Read, along with my dear friend, Irena Polic. Where is she? There she is. So my job this evening is to thank a few of the people and organizations who have made the Deep Read in this event possible, and then turn you over to our moderator who will introduce the panel. When Irena and I created the Deep Read 3 years ago, we shared a conviction that great books have the power to create great communities around themselves, and moreover, that in fostering those communities of readers, the public university fulfills one of its core missions, and that is to create a place for people from different walks of life to meet each other and discuss the existential concerns that they share as human beings. When the Deep Read began, it was a collaboration between the Humanities Institute and Porter College, where I was serving as the provost. But it has always enjoyed indispensable support and encouragement from many people and organizations. And among our benefactors are the following: the Helen and Will Webster Foundation, the Humanities Institute staff, the Council of Provosts, especially the new provost at Porter and the provost at Cowell College, the College Scholars Program and Living Writers Series, the University Library, University Relations, of course, and the Division of Student Affairs and Success. Deep Read has also been blessed with really excellent partners in the community who have allowed us to extend the reach of the program off campus and into the world beyond us. I'm especially grateful, Irena is especially grateful to Bookshop Santa Cruz, Pacific Collegiate School, and Santa Cruz High School. And the mention of those schools is my reminder to myself to tell you that Deep Read is first, last, and always an educational program. The centerpiece of the Deep Read from the beginning is a credit-bearing course for students from all colleges, sponsored by Porter College. And for the last 3 years, the same person has designed and taught that course as our readings have changed. And that instructor is our moderator this evening, the person who is really the third founder and director of the Deep Read in all but name. So, Dr. Laura Martin is a continuing lecturer at Porter College and a program manager at the Humanities Institute. She completed her PhD in literature here at UC Santa Cruz. Her scholarship focuses on the history of the novel, appropriately enough, and also on the transatlantic slave trade. We really have a tremendous privilege this evening in being with her and some of her students in an extension of their classroom and of learning from them and with them. So would you please join me in turning the program over to Dr. Laura Martin.
Thank you so much, Sean. I'm excited to be here with you all and to talk about this interesting book we have here. So I want to begin by explaining how we've organized the evening. First, each of our panelists, whom I will introduce in a moment, will speak for about 5 to 10 minutes about their ideas, their reactions, and their approach to the novel. After their presentations, we'll spend the rest of our time together taking questions from you. And we're going to alternate between questions from the audience here in person and from the audience who's joining us virtually. So for those of you who are joining us here in person, you should have gotten a note card. Did everyone get a note card? Yes? Did anyone not get a note card? Okay. We're going to use these note cards to help facilitate the Q&A process. So please feel free to write questions for the panelists on them while you're listening to their presentations. You're welcome to include your name if you would like to, but you're welcome to leave your name off if you would like to do that. After the presentations, we'll collect them, and then we'll start the Q&A process that way. Okay, now I'd like to introduce our panelists here and let you hear from them. Our first speaker, Vilashini Coopan, is professor of literature and critical race and ethnic studies here at UC Santa Cruz. Her interests include comparative, world, and post-colonial literatures, the history of the novel, and the politics and aesthetics of memory, with a focus on the ongoing legacies of slavery, indenture, colonialism, and apartheid. She was born in South Africa, and she spent her early childhood years in Australia and Canada before moving to the US. She came to the Bay Area in 1989 to go to graduate school in comparative literature at Stanford. And after finishing her degree there, she taught at Yale for 7 years. And then she came back here to the Bay Area to join UCSC in 2004. She teaches courses in literary analysis and literary theory, critical race studies, post-colonial literatures of memory in Africa, the Indian subcontinent and Indian diaspora, Black Britain and the Black diaspora, and the Indian Ocean. She has published numerous articles and essays on post-colonial literature and theory, world literature, and memory studies, and she's the author of Worlds Within, National Narratives and Global Connections in Post-Colonial Writing, which came out from Stanford in 2009. She's completing a book now titled The World at Large, Memoryscapes and World Literature. Next up, I'm gonna go through everybody first. Next up will be our second speaker, Gina Athena Ulysse. She's a Haitian-American feminist artist scholar and professor of feminist studies who joined the faculty here at UC Santa Cruz in 2020. She teaches courses on Black feminisms, feminist methodologies, activism, art, and anthropology. Her rassemblage approach to her research practice entails ongoing crossings and dialogue in the arts, humanities, and social sciences. Her last book, Because When God Is Too Busy, Haiti, Me, and the World, from 2017, was longlisted for the 2017 PEN Open Book Award and received the 2018 Best Poetry Connecticut Center for the Book Award. Her writing has been published in art catalogs and numerous journals, such as Feminist Studies, Journal of Haitian Studies, Interim Poetics, and Curb, Journal of Landscape Architecture, among others. In 2020, she was an invited artist to the Biennale of Sydney, Australia. Over the years, she has been invited to perform at the British Museum, Gorky Theatre, La Mama, Marcus Garvey Liberty Hall, and MoMA Salon. Our final speaker is Chancellor Cynthia Larive. As a first-generation college graduate, a common thread throughout her career has been a commitment to student success, inclusion, and equity. At UC Santa Cruz, Chancellor Larive has prioritized improving retention and graduation rates, and eliminating equity gaps for students from groups traditionally underrepresented in higher education. Chancellor Larive is an accomplished bioanalytical chemist, and she has written extensively on active and experiential learning and mentoring. She has encouraged the participation and success of women and other underrepresented groups in STEM, and has received campus and national awards for her teaching, research, and leadership. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome the panelists, and I'll turn it over to Vilashini.
Thank you, Laura, for that lovely introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. I am a scholar of the novel, and among the novels I study are African novels, and so that's probably one of the first approaches I bring to Transcendent Kingdom. This is a novel that situates Africa, specifically Ghana, in the backdrop and the US or America in the foreground. It's an immigrant novel, a diasporic novel, which is something that Karente Yamashita is going to talk about for our final Deep Read event in the Quarry on May 15th. I'm interested in the dialogue that the novel has with the African novel, which is, of course, a product of the colonial history of British, French, Portuguese, Belgian, Dutch colonialism, Italian colonialism in Africa. There is a moment in Transcendent Kingdom when her brother Nana, Gifty's brother Nana, asks their pastor, what would happen, let's say, hypothetically, in an African village where the word of God had not reached, where missionaries had not penetrated? What would happen to those people? And he says, dude, hypothetically, they're going to hell. And it's a real watershed moment for Gifty, because she's confronting this moment where she understands the difference between American perceptions of Africa and the ways in which Africa might be seen in other frameworks. There's a real echo of this that is fundamental to the birth of the English novel in Africa. Chinua Achebe's great Things Fall Apart from the late 50s by a Nigerian author. And that novel is essentially situated in a period from the 1920s when missionary colonialism and capitalism are coming to that part of the western coast of Africa and are staging a powerful and poignant and ultimately tragic clash between tradition and modernity, between Western orders of logos, or the word, specifically the word of God, but also the word of the colony, and a rich and deep array of indigenous practices, languages, proverbial and folktale traditions, a whole kind of narrative and linguistic and cultural world. And so I think a little bit about the shadow of that tradition of the African novel when we read Gifty's first generation version of the battle between tradition and modernity, or between belief and science. And this is something that she's living at a very personal level, that she's living as she works out her relationship to the things that have been lost to her. You might remember at one point she says in her childhood, I traded religion for science. And I think the book echoes with the cost of that trade and the cost of so many other trades. The first line of the novel reminds us that when her mother took to her bed with her crippling depressions, she colonized that bed like a virus, an uncanny phrase that echoes for us, of course, with the pandemic, but also reminds us of the larger shadow of colonialism against this smaller story of intimate family life, of one's dreams, one's pressing questions, the ghosts that cannot be exorcised. When their kids, Gifty and her brother, say to one another, as their mother tells them there are ghosts in the house, ghosts aren't real, and she chides her children for having become too American. I think this is a novel that's very much about the ghosts of colonialism, about the ghosts of the kinds of narrative forms that were a product of colonialism, the novel being one of them, but also the kinds of language that, and language choices that are made, the style of narration, the clash between the traditional and the modern, and so many other parts. Its ghosts are also deeply personal. They are the ghosts of loss, of trauma, of memory, of the mother she can never have, of the brother who is gone too soon. And that's a really interesting set of questions, because what Gifty ends up doing, like any subject of trauma, is both to reenact what has happened to her in order to work it through. She studies mice in the grips of addiction to figure out why. She's driven in her life to ask two questions. One, why did Christ choose to raise Lazarus? And two, why do these mice, why do some of them, push the leather in order to get their high from the inshore, and why do some not? And I love this part about the novel because it reminds us, all of us, that we live our life driven by questions that are at once deeply personal, that come from somewhere, that come from us. But then it also, because it's a novel, is able to give us so many different ways we might answer this question, ways that are not black and white or cut and dry or either or. The answers she finds, the transcendence of this kingdom, is in fact really ambiguous. And I think that's one of the things, forgive me, Cindy, that a novel can do in a way that science does not always, though I look forward to having that conversation. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Gina Athena.
It was a very difficult book for me to read. I found it difficult. Part of me saying what I need to say, sometimes when I listen to Sade, I'm like, okay, enough already. I need a different version, right? Because you get the same songs, you get the same heartbreak, you get heartbreak, you get heartbreak, you get heartbreak. And I'm like, at some point, you will break. So I think for me, reading the book at this particular moment, when we're all thinking about, well, not all of us, some of us, a lot of us are thinking and talking about what it means to be well. So that was my way in, and I'm working on a project about what it means to be well. So it was really, really hard, and what I'm going to say before I get into some aspects of it, I found myself having to make myself go certain places to read it, right, in order to keep reading, because it was incessant in terms of the violence, in terms of the trauma. So I went to Jack O'Neill's, and I'm like, I'm looking at the sea. It's sunny and it's bright. I put on certain kind of music, you know, just to kind of seeking some sort of harmony within, because I felt Gifty was in the abyss, and what it means for this young Black woman to try to define a self, given that the conditions around which she's trying to make herself are not of her making. Many of them are structural. And she's navigating what it means to live in between all these worlds. And I yearned for a little bit more sunshine. I think, you know, it's important for me to say that. Because it was difficult, then it forced me to have to ask myself, why was I having such a hard time with it, right? So it being difficult doesn't mean I dismiss it. It just means self-confrontation. And it's a good thing that I'm reading Carl Jung about individuation. So that also helped. Yeah, I mean, just thinking about, and one of the reasons that I'm so glad that Vilashini gave us a frame, because I'm an anthropologist by training, and I had to constantly remind myself, this is a book of fiction. And what does it mean, though, for people who are reading this as fiction in terms of the way we tend to think about or have access to other people's narratives and other people's stories and so forth. I didn't find her, the main character, as interesting as I found the brother and the mother. I wished there was more there, in part because I found them to be two-dimensional. And I wanted wholeness. And it was elusive. So then what makes it elusive? Can we bring that in? What does that mean? You know, so it was just, when I first picked up Beloved, I threw it across the room because I was like, hell no, no, no. Similarly with Toni Cade Bambara's The Salt Eaters. And these were both books that pushed me to recognize my own limits. And I didn't want to, and I didn't over-identify with the book, and I wanted to, and I couldn't. So I was caught reading. I've been to Ghana, so I should actually say that as well, and have done a little bit of work around. So trying to see, or her relationship to what Raymond calls the motherland that she didn't like, as the motherland, like her relationship with her mother. I mean, there's just such between her and, you know, she clearly loves her brother, and her mother tells her, I did not really want you as a child. I mean, there's just so much, there was a lot of pain in this book. There's a lot of pain in this book. And right now I'm in full human mode where I'm like, or humanities being routinely questioned. And I wondered why she didn't go into the woods. You know, this is my response to the book. This is the best I've got for you. Because I'm like, why aren't you going into the woods and going forest bathing? I mean, because there was a way that her body, herself becomes this archive of pain. And there's a way, very simple way of thinking about the super, you know, sort of like the Black woman as the superwoman. I felt like that reified that for me in a way that I needed a little bit more nuance. Yeah, I'll say that, and I have a lot more to say, but I wanted to be very frank about it was difficult, it pushed boundaries, but I kept engaging with it. And why did I keep engaging with it? Because I think there's a conversation there. What do we do when we're confronted with something that we don't want to engage with, but it's right there and we kind of have to?
Interesting. Thank you. Cynthia.
Well, so first I'll just say, you know, I feel pretty humbled to be here with these great scholars. And so I read the book, as maybe many others did, just as a book, right? And so I was prepared, you know, that, okay, it's about science. I'm a chemist. I like science. This should be interesting. And what I wasn't prepared for is that I, too, found it very difficult to read. And the reasons I found it so difficult to read was that I had past things that have happened to me that I had buried. And so you can bury things for a while, and then when you least expect it, they can come back out. So in my family, we have a family trait of depression and addiction. And so that was very difficult because, you know, to see her interactions with her mother and to understand how that feels was very challenging for me. The other thing that I could relate to in a way was her experiences in the laboratory. You know, I like laboratories. I miss my laboratory. I gave it up when I came here. And Carol, maybe I'll come over and just hang out and pipette for a while. It's very soothing, you know. She talks about pipetting, and if you haven't done that, you know, that can be soothing. I think mouse brain surgery, probably less so. But, you know, there is maybe this attention to detail. And for many years, my laboratory was kind of my escape. You can escape into the laboratory and leave everything else kind of behind because your attention is really focused on the details of an experiment. The other thing, though, that I felt in her was the being of someone other, right? To be the one Black woman, right, in the department, to be something that is other, and how hard that can be, and that you know, people can say things or treat you in a way. Maybe they don't mean it to be this way. Maybe they do sometimes. That is to put you in your place. And I could see her grappling with that in the way that she was progressing through. And, you know, the relationship that she had to try to sort between religion and science is not a conflict that I've faced, really. Very deeply. Maybe I haven't thought about it deeply enough. It's possible that that's also true. But you know, there doesn't seem to be a good resolution to that question. And so maybe that's also why you found it a little bit dissatisfying.
Thank you. Okay. I have a question for us while we gather the note cards. If you have a note card and you have a question, if you would just kind of raise it up and we'll come around and collect them. But while we're doing that, I thought that I'd pose a question to the panel that has come up in class. So the first question is about disciplinarity. or fields of knowledge. And I was thinking it would be interesting. It actually, I think it relates to some of what we're talking about. And I thought it'd be interesting to start with because, you know, we're all from different disciplines. You all are from different disciplines, if I can get that out. So this question comes from two of my students, Nat, who I think is joining us virtually, and Z, who is right here. So I have a bit of background to lay out before we get to the questions, so bear with me, please. So at many points in the novel, we see Gifty express discomfort or even skepticism about other disciplines other than neuroscience, right? And really about how these disciplines approach the questions and things and issues that she's interested in, you know, namely addiction and depression, or as she keeps putting it, reward-seeking behavior and restraint. So she has these kind of euphemisms too that she uses. I mean, there's this point that she talks to her mom, right? I never tell her exactly what I'm doing. I say reward-seeking behavior and restraint, right? Which I think is interesting. But so for one example is, you know, we see Gifty express disbelief at the humanities' approach to pressing issues, you know, such as prison reform, climate change, and the opioid epidemic. And it's in this flashback where she's at a dinner party with her boyfriend Raymond, who's in the PhD program in modern thought and literature at Stanford, which is hilarious. And so it's him and some of his cohort, you know, there, and he's cooked a cassoulet, and you know. But she says this, and it's on page 74 at the bottom if you have your book and want to check it out. But she says this, whenever I listen to his friends speak about these issues in the simultaneously intelligent but utterly vacuous way of people who think it's important simply to weigh in, to have an opinion, I would bristle. I would think, what is the point of all this talk? What problems do we solve by identifying problems, circling them? Which, of course, is her take on what the humanities does. It's like all talk. It's all discourse, right? So at other points, so she, you know, critiques other disciplines too, like especially psychology. So at several points she says, you know, I steered away from psychology. She calls it a soft science, right? At several points. But in a later part of the book, though, she tells us about reading Bennett and Hacker's Philosophical Foundations of Neuroscience in college, which explains that neuroscientists can't simply replace psychological explanations with neurological ones. Because the brain is not separate from the total human being. You can't separate it out like in the way that neuroscientists want to do. So it's the whole human being, they say, that perceives and thinks and reasons, not just the brain. So in this section, this is on 210 and 211, if you want to see. I'm a teacher, right? Okay. She's contending with their idea, you know, that psychology and neuroscience must work together in order to, as she puts it, quote, address the full range of human behavior. So finally to the questions. What finally gets Gifty to, she sort of almost admits that psychology is as equally important as neuroscience, or at least works in concert with it. And do you think that's right as an idea? And do you think she ever gets to the same place with the humanities? And overall, I think it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on what you think this novel is saying about disciplinarity or fields of knowledge, and you know what you think about what you think the novel is saying. So lots of questions there, and whoever wants to jump in.
I'm happy to start.
Cool.
Actually, the program that Gifty's boyfriend Raymond goes to was my sister program at Stanford. I was in comparative literature. This was modern thought and literature, and I went to many of those dinner parties and through them myself. And I'm reminded of something that often happens in my literary theory classes, which is students asking me, well, I see that you want to get us to change how we think, but why? I mean, what is the good of that, and what happens if I learn to deconstruct a binary and not to think in black and white? What is the take-home of that? And I often say, well, whenever we dismantle any structure and see the foundational premises of it, we get to ask some really potent and potentially transformative questions that you don't get to ask unless you strip things all the way down to the bones, or the neurons in this case. And so I feel that is something that urge, what this novel often refers to as the questions, are something that cut across disciplines, whether we ask them about different kinds of material or with different critical vocabularies. And one of the things that happens to Gifty is she sees herself at first as a very question-driven person, a hypothesis person, and she's looking for answers in the lab and also in her own life, whether it's with religion or whether it's with trying to solve the tragic puzzle of how it is that this could have happened to her brother, how it is that her mother could disappear. And all of these questions, I mean, I think at the end she says, there's a moment where she says, maybe I can only have the questions, right? The closer I get to trying to uncover the objects, this is on 212, Laura, the farther away the objects move. And so there's this kind of, if the objects are always out of our grasp, if her mother, as she says at one point, is somebody I can never know,
Yeah.
if her brother and his sinking into addiction is a path she can watch but not understand, all we're left with is the capacity to pose what I would say the asking question. And I think that's something that the novel really gives us back to. Yes, I wish that the modern thought literature folks could also have posed these questions. I think one of the things that the book does do that is very much within the wheelhouse of the humanities is that it is in the composition of this novel that takes, if you look at the last word, what does she say, the very last line of the novel? I try to make order, make sense, make meaning of the jumble of it all. So everything for her is a puzzle, a conundrum, a reason to wrestle it into the shape of her understanding. And she approaches this with hypotheses and linearities and causes and sequences, and sometimes those work, they give her papers. But what the novel gives us is a really remarkable non-linear account where the time of loss and the time of discovery and the time of the mother and the time of the brother are always happening, as Morrison says, all of it is now, right? So there's this kind of really different way shall we say, the container or the petri dish of a novel can actually hold many different temporal and philosophical phenomena together, both the question and the answer, both the past and the present. And I think that's a really, if the modern literature folks didn't have the answer, the novel's form, I would say, offers us one kind of way to hold our uncertainties. Right? It's not a novel that's an answer, it's a novel that's a series of questions.
Interesting.
Well, that's a really great question. One of the things that I like to say is that no subject lives their lives along disciplinary lines,
Yeah.
right? Being able to discern between what's the making of universities, whether it's divisions and departments and so forth, and then the reality of how we live. I'm not having a biological experience right now any more than I'm having a government experience right. So that for me was something that I saw, that I appreciated, and at the same time, I have a hard time. I don't read novels, okay? So I think it's so important that I have to just be really honest. I would have preferred to read a book of poetry, for lots of reasons. So for me, though, what I thought was really fascinating is this emphasis on this individual. And I didn't always get the sense of how Gifty understood herself as a social being, as part of a social collective, right? So, which is one of the reasons in that early interview I talked about Zora Neale Hurston and individuation, in part because the other part of this story, it's all about class.
Yeah.
It's all about capitalism. It's all about the fact that folks who are minoritized, who migrate to the United States, end up in these positions. I mean, the mothers work who had to deal with racism, blatant cruelty on a daily basis, and did so working 2 jobs to make sure that she could afford her children the best that she could. The fact that the father left. I mean, and because when he came to the United States, he ended up in this, precarious position. The fact that Nana really was a commodity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That people had their dreams and their hopes in, because if he can actually become this star, then he's going to help get the family out of where they are. So for me, the part about structure, the part about racial capitalism, is I could not see it.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's one of the other shadows in terms of their life conditions and how they had to negotiate what it means to. There's a Haitian American scholar who talks about what it means to be black twice. For immigrants who come to the United States who are not African American, and how they're negotiating, the blackness that's perceived and then the blackness at home, right? So I found this absence of structure, and thinking about, so. But then at the same time, there's a point where she talks about how she would take notes on Nana and thought of herself as an anthropologist.
Yeah.
And then I kept thinking, oh my God, navel gazing. Where's you in relation to the world that you're a part of? And then recognizing the limits of that, right? Mm-hmm. That I could never understand my brother no matter how much notes I take, right? So then there's some grace there, there's some humility there.
Right.
So I'm going to tackle this question from the point of disciplinarity. And, I could resonate with Gifty's asking of questions. And science, in a way, is a way of knowing, right? Science is a way of knowing, and there's comfort in knowing. And yet you can't use science to know everything, right? And so that's at this interface of her trying to rationalize neuroscience and psychology. I think about these disciplines in the context of the university, and at UC Santa Cruz, we value interdisciplinarity in a way that isn't true for all universities. But if you think about those disciplines, they're human constructs, right? They don't come from first principles.
Right.
Humans divined them over time because we can't grasp all of the vast knowledge of the world, of the universe. And so in time, the disciplines, like a tribe, develops their own language, they develop their own customs, their own culture. Sometimes those cultures are toxic. Sometimes they're open. And so as we think about what can we learn from the humanities, I think you brought that up, right? This doesn't have to be the humanities versus science, right? We should embrace different perspectives. That's what we get at a university, is the perspectives. I mean, we've all brought very different perspectives just to this one book, right? And probably the 7,000 people who are reading this book will all have a slightly different perspective on the book. That's really beautiful. And that literature can catalyze those thoughts, those conversations that help us not only understand what the author is trying to say, what the characters are trying to say, but each other as human beings.
Thank you. Did we want to go to a question from the virtual audience? Or you want to do this one? Okay, let's do it. I think I can read it. Okay. Does the novel suggest that science, which is a kind of refuge for Gifty, is capable of generating the values we need to live a good life? If not, where does the novel tell us we can find those values?
It's a big question.
Just, yeah. Should I read it again, or we got it?
No,
please.
Read it again?
Yes, please.
Okay. Does the novel suggest that science, which is a kind of refuge for Gifty, is capable of generating the values we need to live a good life? So can science generate values that we need to live a good life?
Well, who's we? We're not a collective
Readers
we.
of the novel?
No. But we're not a collective we, right? Because we're all differentially positioned.
Sure.
You know, I mean, I think. Oh, I'm jumping in.
No,
That's good. Oh, do it.
Right? Because I mean that would be my first part.
Yeah.
In terms of like thinking about that question, because
Yeah.
I would love to find universals. I think we all would love, especially in this particular moment.
Well, this moment that you brought up in your interview too, where she's talking with Catherine about the
Right.
not wanting to join the women in STEM group.
Right, because also to Cindy's point is, you know, she just wants to be.
Yeah.
But the world does not allow her to do that. She's always going to be a black woman, whether she wants to be that or not. So I would ask this person, who's we? Because I think that answer for me would it depends. It actually really depends. I don't think there's a singular answer there, to your point.
I would just say, I think science can bring us values. I think science, if science is the pursuit of knowledge, right, then knowledge brings value to the world. You can use knowledge for good or evil, right? And science similarly can be done in that way. But I think beyond science, I think that, you know, Gifty's looking for she's searching. And so science is a way to search for something in an organized way and to find some answers, even when other kinds of answers that she's searching for are harder to find.
Well, and I think that's such a great point, and it's interesting that at the end of the novel, we have on the one hand this kind of Hollywood ending, right? Where, oh, she gets her lab at Princeton, she marries the nice guy in the lab, everything has resolved. I mean, it's really at odds with the kind of freight and weight of the pain of the narrative so far, and so I find it a little jarring and a little improbable, especially since the novel seems to be much more concerned with what it means to keep wrestling with what we sometimes call on this campus difficult questions, and indeed at the THI, right? That they're things that have to be, you know, constantly wrestled with. But one of the things she says at the end is that she's no longer interested in other worlds or spiritual planes. I've seen enough in a mouse to understand transcendence, holiness, redemption. And I think that's fascinating. So I've seen enough in a mouse, i.e. science and the problems it considers and the methods that it adopts, to understand transcendent holiness, redemption, to understand religion. And I think that's the kind of ambiguous holding two paradoxically and seemingly opposed systems of belief in one hand. It is precisely the mouse that becomes the transcendent kingdom, not the alternative. So it's you know, what has been staged in some ways as a choice, at least on the level of that sentence, and maybe even on the level of the way the novel takes her through various watershed moments where it seems like it's a pitched battle. Pick this one or pick this one. Go that way or go the other way. Is that there is a kind of, you know, improbable union there that suggests that the good life is perhaps both about formulating these questions but recognizing that answers one holds in one's hand are not really necessarily the prize.
And she's so focused on, or what she seems to learn is that there are things you can't know.
Right.
Right? I mean, it's interesting because she gets into science because she's really interested in specificity, right? She wants to know the specific neurological place where addiction happens and you know, where reward seeking happens, and she wants to fix that, right?
Yes.
But she can kind of locate it, but she can never get as close as she wants, right? Like she can't get the answer.
Right. And it won't bring her brother back.
No, exactly. And she says that at some point.
Yeah.
But what she does learn is something more general. Like we could call it a general value, I guess, and it's what you said, like, you know, that we need to keep asking questions and trying to get closer to, I don't know, small t truths, you know? But we can't ever get there fully, but we have to keep doing it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
I think so.
Yeah.
This question is in some ways a good follow-on from the conversation we're having. Comes from Jody Green, literature professor and director of the Center for Innovations of Teaching and Learning. It feels like the novel suggests at times that science is a place where we can work through issues of our humanity and religion isn't. This is kind of counterintuitive. What do you think about how science and religion are portrayed in the novel?
I feel like science is portrayed pretty realistically in the novel, from my perspective. The religion is harder for me to ascertain, and so there's aspects of religion that are kind of doctrinal and habitual, and those can often be the focus of religion. There's another aspect that for me is in nature. And is in trying to understand the world. And I don't see a kind of a conflict between those aspects and science. But the doctrinal aspects often are imposed by other people. That makes it harder to really integrate into a thought structure or feeling.
I think both of religion and science in the novel are also institutions. They're placed within particular sites. The church that her mother first finds in Alabama is the first church she happens to see with that "Are you lost?" sign, and she goes in not realizing this is a predominantly white Pentecostal church that is very different from the Ghanaian tradition she has come out of, and it's one that Gifty experiences as a place of real alienation, and yet also of a kind of longing to belong through the gesture of being saved. And so in the same way that the lab, as you were just saying, Cindy, has these deep embedded structures of racialized and gendered and classed power and privilege, and so we can't think them. They're both discourses, and they're institutions, and they're belief systems, and they're kind of elaborate child fantasies of having a certain kind of absolute power. What if she, like Christ, could raise someone from the dead? What if you could, through science, solve the what if and why question? And so I think that the ways in which we're asked to sort of refract this thing we call science and this thing we call religion, often sort of universalized or vilified or dismissed or made into a certain kind of object. We're asked to see it in so many different prismatic lights in the novel, and that does some work. I think it lets us see the intersections when they happen between her quest for science and something that you're so right, Cindy, something that feels spiritual, though it is not, I think, in the form of organized religion. She has that wonderful psychedelic moment with her mushrooms and her friend Anne, and feels a kind of, she says, religious experience in that period. And I think it feeds back through the nature into some other forms of healing, though I agree with Gina Athena, this is a novel that is tragically short on healing. Or we have healing for some and not for others.
Wow. I mean, I think for me, that was what was most interesting.
The religion and science.
The battle, the pursuit, the fact that I kept thinking again, what's the ultimate sign of sort of arrival as an immigrant person, right, in terms of pursuing the American dream, right? Gets a PhD, has a lab, ends up working, in Ivy and so forth, but recognizing the limits of both, and struggling, to find herself. I think the part, when she was talking about Lazarus, and she kept talking about the cross, and I was like, you need to put down your cross. Just like, how aware is she of her own struggles?
Yeah.
And what does it mean to be, to make self, to find self only through struggle? And that in and of itself is this religious narrative, right? It's sort of like, I'm like, you're Jesus, you're about to go on the cross eventually. So I found that fascinating, and I also thought, I was a bit heartened that at times I thought she was going in the direction where it's, clearly, science rules, and then seeing that, well, I'm in the church. Which may say something more about socialization in terms of, where and what we find comfort in terms of how one is reared, right? Because as much as there was a lot of tension between her and the pastor, and when she went to the altar, finally, that was such a moment, and she's like, I don't understand, but something in me is going, right? So I thought those moments were little moments of surrender, which were, important in terms of giving the character some nuance and texture, because at times I felt that it was, I wondered where was the body. It was an embodied person, sort of in this sort of cerebral fight. And it was, a lot of it was up here. Where was the salvation? And looking for that. And so then for me, that very Western way of thinking about religion as the opioid of the masses and so forth, I was like, phew, I thought we were more sophisticated than that. And understanding that framing in and of itself is also part of the battle, right? I also, there were little glimpses, little moments where, after Nana died and then the funeral in Ghana, and it's like they're wearing certain kind of clothing and so forth. So you got a little glimpse of like there's maybe something else. Not a whole lot, but I thought that was important. And, but ultimately, I thought, this is about the struggle. This is the human condition, and where do we find ourselves and how do we make these decisions and try to be whole?
Yeah.
Find our path.
That's really interesting. I keep thinking, to Jody's question about whether religion ever helps her work through other questions, or I feel like
it's the opposite, actually.
I think it is, but I think there are points where she does. She has this crisis of faith, right? When she experienced this horrible racism in the church, right? And it's really church and religion as institution, as you pointed out, Vilashini, before. And so she overhears these people talking about her brother, and what did they say? Something like, their kind has a taste for drugs, and then like some associative comment about crime. It's just this classic horribleness of war on drugs sort of thinking. And she overhears that as an 11-year-old and is like, she couldn't believe it, that the church would turn on her brother when he is in a moment of need, And she has this, that's basically where it ends for her there. And she's sent to Ghana, she resists going to church. She really doesn't want to go back, even though she kind of redoubles her effort, a little bit. And then, she's kind of done with it also. But then she can't shake this, I think, religious upbringing either, or the spiritual aspects of it that are useful to her. Like, I just keep thinking about how she's in her lab, she prays for her mice, right? She has these religious, spiritual rituals around her mice and how she treats them. And I think it also often dovetails with kind of ethical moments in the novel around animal testing, which come up, occasionally. And there's one moment where she baptizes the mice, and she is almost like thanking them for their sacrifice. That's just how I read it, And so in those moments, I think she's trying to use religion to, work through scientific problems or scientific ethical issues, in interesting ways. And if we take it seriously and we're not like, oh, she's baptizing mice, weird, but
Right.
but
And I think she's trying to do that in a remarkably scientific way.
Always.
Right. So there's this
Always,
moment
yeah.
where she's listening. One of the pastors, Pastor John, talks about the Word being God,
Right.
and she says, well, the Word is God, but then she learns that the word is logos, which is translated as plea, but also as premise,
Right.
indeed as a question. So what happens if the Word, on the one hand, is being presented to her as God, but is also on take two, and she learns this, in the sermon itself as question, and then what she does, and it goes back to what Gina Athena is saying about her kind of anthropological habits, she starts writing down all these lists to God of questions about everything that she wants to know the answer to. And so I think like in that very, meditation simply even on the word, a category that would seem to be proper to religion, but the novel gives it to us as also formed, constituted as scientific inquiry. And here's yet another instance of where, at a very granular micro level, this novel will not let you constitute science versus religion as an either or battle, but rather as something, I think she's trying or maybe coming to some kind of synthesis that is a transcendence, but not a I'm going this way or I'm going that way.
the transcendence is that imbrication or something. You know what I mean?
A minor transcendence.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do we have more?
Can I just myself make a comment about that? This last phase of the conversation, I think I would agree with Laura that the novel is much more even-handed in its presentation of religion and the potential long-term value of a religious life, or at least of an openness to religious questioning. When I read the novel the first time, I thought what I was reading was a story about a person who was raised in religion, had an experience of profound disillusionment and disenchantment with it, and outgrew it, until you reach the weird ending of the novel where she says, I don't care about these things anymore, although she's an Episcopalian, so that's... I'm not going to go further with that part of my comment. But the novel nevertheless continues to raise, in the present in which she is telling the story, right? I mean, she is the person who is writing the novel from adulthood, right? A very serious question about whether we are creatures with souls as well as brains, or whether we are creatures with brains alone. And you don't have to be religious to see that there is a lot of consequence packed into that question. So I was looking at pages 76 and 77 of the paperback, where she's chewing over that question of whether the soul is the mind, is the brain. And she specifically asks, or says, my life now feels so at odds with the religious teachings of my childhood that I wonder what the little girl I once was would think of the woman I've become. But at the end of that paragraph, she says, the truth is I haven't much changed. My soul is still my soul, even if I rarely call it that. And one of the things that Vilashini said at the beginning of her comments about the structure of the novel that I think is really helpful in sorting through what the long-term implications of Gifty's religion, so to speak, is that it's not as though the moments in the novel when she's a child quoting from scripture were composed in her childhood. She is an adult now, fabricating this story, which is the novel, still quoting from scripture in order to explain these fundamental experiences, right? So even though she says, I'm not interested in questions of religion anymore, part of the fabric of her character is the scripture that she has internalized through a very complex and somewhat unhappy experience. And so there's no erasing that from the person she's become, and therefore from the way she thinks about science as another source of meaning.
Interesting. Do we have other note card questions? I have other things too, but Yeah?
I can ask another question from the online, but if anybody in the room has cards, just put your hand in the air and we'll come around and collect them. Joel asks kind of a two-part question. What differs about our protagonist's voice and point of view as a black woman who did not descend from a U.S. slave? And then he's asking really about her point of view as a first-gen student in higher ed and how she might be relatable to our own first-gen students here.
I mean,
I think you should repeat. Could you repeat the question again, and then someone else can start? Yeah.
So, it just disappeared from me for just a second. What differs about our protagonist's voice and point of view as a black woman who did not descend from a U.S. slave? And does she share her point of view with our first-gen students?
I think you spoke a lot to this, Gina, both Gina Athena, in your opening remarks and in your written comments for the deep read. But in terms of thinking about the difference between being African and being African American, and the particular class formations. I mean, Gifty is somebody who starts out, with her mother barely making it and ends up going to Stanford and Harvard and teaching, becomes a sort of peripatetic journey around the Ivy League and dreams of a Nobel Prize. And so there's that trajectory that, if we think of it formulaically as a narrative, that American dream story is really realized in the novel, right? It is a fantasy that comes true in a way that fantasy dream she has of her mother's Sleeping Beauty, where she'll be washed back to Ghana on the seas of golden sand and given a mermaid's tale and happily returned. That kind of return to the origin of the place she has left is impossible, but it is one of the, I think, the fantasies and the ironies, and possibly one of the occlusions of the novel, that it preserves the American dream without asking maybe as many questions as we might ask for just how it is that Gifty can get there. And so I think that you've brought up a couple times, Gina Athena, the question of class as this central axis in the novel, and I'm definitely thinking about that. I'm also thinking, when you asked, the person out there asked about the difference in narrative voice, and we've invoked already Toni Morrison's Beloved, which, as I think the central text of the voice of the enslaved woman. One of the things that text does is it jumps around in time. It constructs a story that is partly evidentiary and partly fictively imagined and reimagined to give us something that didn't happen, right? To give us something back in compensation or reparation for the traumas of the past. And that is a very particular kind of voice that is, I think, different from the American dream, this is what I would like to have. So I think the registers, right, of loss and reparation and dream and getting are really distinctive ones. That's not to say you can't write immigrant fiction in the modality or the expressive form of longing. Much of it has been done, but I think the longing is quieter in this novel. Mm-hmm. And that's interesting to me. She knows she's going to get it.
Right.
She does.
Yeah. So I'm always curious about how we think and talk about the American dream now versus what it used to be. So the second part of the question, in terms of thinking about first generation students here, the question I always ask is it structurally possible what is structurally possible now versus what was structurally possible 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And that's not to say that one should not dream, because my goodness, where would we be if we did not? But just realistically speaking, in terms of, you know, what is possible now? And we're living in a moment globally where we have to rethink a lot of things, and who we are, who we want to be, what is possible. You know, and just the most concrete thing I can think of is the fact that now when people are applying for colleges or for graduate school, you know, they're sending out, you know, 10, 15, 20 applications. When I applied, I sent out 3. You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, there's a huge difference in terms of the time that we're living in. And thinking about young people now and the world they're inheriting, how they're negotiating that, you know, so for me, you know, I'm always cautious around how to have that conversation about the American dream, what it used to be and what's actually possible now. And I think that's a question for young people to have. Like, I can't even begin, but I have a lot of hope in y'all, so I'm ready to listen.
I think I have great hope. I have great hope for our students, especially first-generation students. I think that there is a great deal that's possible. It's hard to see a straight line path. So what I think is different now than 30 years ago is the paths are not straight line, they're more curved. People will likely have more than one career, right? We might have 6 or 7 careers, but there's opportunity in that too.
I keep thinking about her loneliness in the context of being a first-generation student, and how those things might be related. And I mean, I'm not a first-generation student, but I've taught in first-generation cohorts before, and we're trying to, you know, where you try to create a community for first-generation students so they don't feel that way. I mean, because it's interesting when there's that moment in the novel where Gifty's telling her mom about, you know, I'm going to study science, and she thinks that she's going to not like it, or she's prepared for her not to like it and not to support her. And she does, right? She's fine with it. And in many respects, it comes up in the novel where Gifty says, like, her parents aren't the typical immigrant parents, which I also think is interesting. But I keep thinking about that moment of what if her mom was not supportive, right? Right. And this happens to first-generation students, right? Like, what it means to follow your career path and goal is to mean disconnection from your family, loss there, or loneliness, you know. So yeah, that's what comes up for me there, which I think the novel gives us moments to wrestle with questions like that.
I can speak to that. So, you know, I'm a first-generation student. You know, my dad didn't finish the 3rd grade and never learned to read, worked in a mine. And, you know, I, for a long time, struggled with, did I belong at the university? Did I belong in my profession? And so getting students to know that they belong here, they can achieve great things. And, you know, that's the power of UC Santa Cruz. That's the power of what we can help people do, is to realize their dreams. But it isn't always very easy.
And it's difficult for, I think, some in different ways, right? Because I think what it means to be a minority person on this campus is beyond challenging. So for me, I've thought a lot about, I mean, I'm a first generation, but I don't want to talk about myself. And just too much to say. At some point, there will be a memoir. But the part is the shame, right? And the shame, the silence that she carries, right? class is a taboo still in the United States, and in a place like this where things seemingly look so loose and whatever in Santa Cruz, but there are very clear class lines here, right? So I think, you have to learn how to read it, to sort of have a sense of who's who, what does that mean, how people present themselves. I mean, I was very fortunate. I taught an in-person class in the fall, and I remember, talking to the students about the food pantry, and not just that there is one, but who minds it? Why is it that the ones who need it the most are the ones who are also minding it, right? Like in terms of the various ways that the inequity is blatant, and I'm finding myself, talking to students and saying, I wish for you to be able to just focus on what it means to be learning right now, because that is such a precious thing, and it took me years to get to that point, which is one of the reasons I'm very clear about boundaries and lines, saying, no, my contemplative time is my contemplative time, and because it's such a precious thing, and not everybody gets to have that. Right, so then just thinking around class lines and what's possible and what's not possible. And so for me, one of the things that I'm committed to is, to the extent that is possible, is to sort of help support students in recognizing what it means to be able to have that luxury of thinking. Because we don't know what we're capable of until we're in that space. Really? And a lot of us probably will never be in that space comfortably because things are what they are, economically, socially. So there's something for me that I want to just talk about, the social luxury of being, right? What it means to just live and be. And that as a yearning is something that I think we need to fight for people to have experience at some point in their life. Period.
I have a question. So we're kind of a little bit stuck in the pinball machine of the novel's characterization of science and religion as a dichotomy that she's trying to figure out where she stands in relation to. But of course, there is a third way that the novel presents the project of making meaning out of experience, which is fiction itself. She is, after all, a novelist at the end of the novel that she writes. That's one of the advantages of having a narrator who is conscious that she is telling someone a story and writing. So there's a question in there somewhere, and it is, how fiction triangulates religion and science as forms of meaning-making, right? You talked a little bit about this in your first comment, Vilashini, right? What is it that art, which is not properly considered an academic discipline or a spiritual practice, right? I mean, and these are all constructs, but how does art enter into the novel as a solution of sorts to the conflict that the novel stages between religion and science as points of view on the meaning of her experience?
It's a great question, and I share with you all of the literary critical sensibilities behind it. And I like you, Sean, I do believe that that literary forms can actually make meaning in ways that hold possibilities open rather than slice and dice or divvy them out. And one of the moments I'm reminded of is in that passage where, I think it's on 134, where she learns that the word of God actually means logos, and that logos means plea or premise. She recalls her young self thinking, I liked the ambiguity of it. And that's what representational language allows us to hold in our hands, as much as we were touching the head of that mouse is ambiguity, is the co-constitutive possibilities of two or more kinds of meaning at the same time. And later, there's a really wonderful moment on 272 where she talks about the demands of scientific writing versus humanistic writing. My writing was slow and dry, and it captured the facts of my experiment, but said nothing of what it had felt like to hold a mouse in my hands and feel its entire body thump against my palms as it breathed, as its heart beat. I wanted to say that too. I wanted to tell somebody about the wave of relief I felt every time I watched an addicted mouse refuse the lever. The gesture, the refusal, all of these things were part of what she wanted to have. And eventually, if you follow that passage to the bottom of 273, she recalls that when she watched the mouse refuse the lever, she remembered what it was to be saved, that this was grace, that it was a hand, a touch, a fiber optic implant, a lever, a refusal. It was sweet. And of course, it is the fact that this is a novel, that it has given us the lever, the mouse brain, the tender touch that she caresses her mother with in these moments when she can't get through to her in any way. She always remembers the curve of her mother's back, which is both this terrible, broken body of the archive of pain that Gina Athena is talking about, but also a kind of possibility of this connection. So the novel gives us tenderness, rationality, science, belief, saving grace in episodic ways and moments of recall, and we see that. But it also, I think, at this critical moment when she is meditating on, of all things, what it means to write, that we see them gathered into what I've called the petri dish of the novel. I don't even know if petri dishes would be in this kind of lab. Probably not. Probably a terrible metaphor, right? But I think I agree with you, Sean, about those capacities for minor transcendence.
Others?
I think she did right.
I have a question about the ending. Do we have time for another question? So Vilashini, you mentioned the ending, or it's almost like an epilogue. I don't know, there's so much time that's jumped and things that are jumped over. So we have a question about, this. Do you think that the epilogue of Transcendent Kingdom would be strengthened by showing what happens in between the final chapter and then, when Gifty is already at Princeton with Han and, happily ever after time? Or is seeing Gifty finally past her difficulties in life more impactful? Like, is there something useful about jumping over all of that time, or
Is there something
useful about jumping over all of this time and we get this sort of improbable happy ending to some degree, but thoughts?
I don't think it's improbable, though.
No?
I mean, that's why it redeemed itself for me.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, strangely, right?
Yeah.
But
I guess I don't mean improbable like it couldn't happen, but it's like, what? You go from, all of this place of struggle and then
Well, I mean, for me, this is where I imagine that she comes to grace at some point, right, with this fighting that doesn't end. We do learn from that, right? We see her learn from that over time, in terms of being able to recognize she's never going to know her brother. She's never going to know her mother, right? I mean, it's like there's a lot of introspection, and if she's listening to herself, I mean, I think the fact that for her, in the end, or ultimately part of it was about making meaning. And I remember somebody said to me recently, we all want to be happy, but in the end, did we make meaning? I was like, ugh, dude. But I want to be happy, but but that's actually the question. Did we make meaning? Are we in pursuit of meaning in our lives? And what does that look like? And it's not always it's not always easy. It's not an easy road. Who feels it knows. Here I am quoting Bob Marley. But because it's relevant, right? Because it's still the human condition. It's still that fight and that struggle. Here's what I was born into. Here is how, even though she doesn't speak to it as structural, it's still an individual life dealing with these forces, both inside and outside of herself. And I think we can all surmise that they continue. I don't think we needed another 200 pages to see that.
Like, here are all the present day struggles.
Do you know what I mean? Like, I mean, I think for me, I just, I felt like I got spared maybe a little bit. Well, no, because the pain of it, right? Because I did find it, just a lot of pain. So, but for me, that's where there was, at some point, this character, sort of, this is what my life is like now. And the fact that she was at that church to me, sort of like, and that's what I meant earlier about, when you're socialized, to sort of have a sense and a particular understanding of the world, you just shake that off. And sometimes, sure, and other times not. So for me, I just thought, okay, there's surrender. That's it.
That's nice. Good. Other thoughts about the ending?
That was so beautiful, Gina Athena. I'm glad that we didn't have your 200 pages, actually. I think I think that that sometimes one of the things I wish this novel had done less of is give us linear accounts. I mean, it gives us little mini linear accounts, but then they turn into spirals, and then they loop back into the past, and they do many different things. But there is a sort of, you have this sense that you're reading a journey narrative, and that's why I didn't love the Hollywood ending, which was too pat and too wrapped up and too neat for me. So if I'd gotten the 200 pages in between, it would be one thing if it complicated the getting to the end and getting the Nobel and the Princeton job and the husband and the dog and whatever it is. But I don't know if those 200 pages in between would have just made it almost less interesting. I like that the puzzle of how she gets from this impasse that the novel so searingly and painfully leaves us with, is then we have to fill in. Right. We have to make sense. We have to go back and say, wait, did I miss it? Were there moments of minor transcendence all the way along? How did this happen? How did she come to this peace? And the novel doesn't necessarily have to tell us, I came to this peace. But rather it becomes part of what she calls so nicely at the end, this making meaning of the jumble of it all. And so it's really readerly meaning as much as gifty's meaning that allows for saving grace, I think, in the end, and means that even if her story isn't your story of transcendence, you can identify perhaps with the process of coming to some terms with the past, which is what she has been struggling with.
I'm just looking at the end. It's almost too, something we haven't talked about, but that's interesting here is, and something we've been talking about in class a lot, is the relationship between her, personal experience and her research. Mm-hmm. And in so many places she says, it's too noble to say that I'm doing this for my brother, right? And my mother, by extension, I always read, And she has lots of things to say about why she's doing what she's doing. Some of it, I think, very much inspired by the racism that she experiences. And so she's sort of driven to prove, the racist people at her church wrong, to the racist people at the soccer game, wrong. And she talks about how she's going to have to, we know this narrative, like, be better than the best. right? In order to be seen, in order to be taken seriously, in order to be valued. But then there are also moments where, so she says, I'm doing it for me, right? And proving everyone wrong. And that's her sort of way to fight racism and other things too, I think. But there are other moments where it's clear that she's doing it for her brother and her mom. And I find this point at the end where she's at the church, right? Like she's trying to make meaning of that relationship between what she's experienced and why she's, followed this neuroscientific, career path. But she's in the church, and she, this line that you're bringing up, Vilashini, that's so lovely here. I think, I try to make order, make sense, make meaning of the jumble of it all. Always I light 2 candles before I go. So her mom, her brother, acknowledging, right? And that's very beautiful and poetic way, there's a connection here, right? Which I think is really interesting. And I guess I wonder if you all have any thoughts about this theme that runs through their book of personal experience and how that relates to what she's doing, her research and her career. And
don't you think it's true for all of us, right? We're not one-dimensional. Yeah. We have many aspects. We have our relationships. We might have our religion, our views, our own past that we grapple with, and then our vocations. Sometimes it's more than a job. Sometimes it's a vocation, right? It's a passion. And so how do we integrate those things into a 3-dimensional being that can shapeshift, right? That may be different in one place, different in another.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah.
It's time. It's time. Thank you so much to our panelists. It's getting cold too. And thank you for you all for coming. Grab a coat. I know.